Hey guys, welcome to a new video. Like, comment and subscribe if you enjoy. Without any further interruptions, enjoy the What If. Chapter 2. God's Got One Hell of an Alarm Clock Part 1. Lucifer Mansion, the Underworld, 10 years ago. Graphia Lucifuge found her mornings to have turned rather stressful in the last year. Every morning, the Queen of Lucifer would wake before the sun had risen, dress herself in the attire she felt most comfortable in, give a light awakening to her lord husband before heading towards the kitchens. Like always, she was met with greetings from the kitchen staff, who were likewise awake and readying themselves for their daily preparations, offering only a curt nod before starting over to the kitchen's head chef to discuss her beloved and child's meals for the morning. After, she would deliver her first meal to her husband, sharing a small breakfast alongside him as he voiced his duties for the day and share in light conversation. He would ask her about the world, her duties or wants for the day, but most often would ask about their child and how he was doing. It was a pattern fulfilled for many years and one which neither could actually claim issue towards. But those responsibilities were hardly what she would call demanding. Actually, it was what came after these pleasant mornings which made the Lady Lucifuge feel a migraine coming on. With her duties for her lord complete, at least for the present time, Graphia would return to the kitchens to procure her son's meal and deliver it to the main dining hall. The child would argue, now and then, that a meal in bed worked fine for him, but Graphia wouldn't have it. She was his mother, and she would be damned if she neglected to teach him etiquette. Eating a full breakfast, with plenty of vitamins and nutrients on a tabled setting, seemed like a good place to start. Daily, the lady of the house would knock on her child's bedroom door, beckoning him to rise and prepare himself for the day. "Naruto, it is time to wake," she would call out, and usually be met with a responsive grunt or mumbled confirmation from the other side. In the past, the promise of food would awaken the boy quite easily. And he was always grateful and eager for his meal. But as of late, once Graphia called for Naruto to rise, all she was met with was silence. The first instance this occurred, when the queen found her child missing, she went on what her lord husband would only call a mildly destructive search for her missing baby. Sirzex would defend her aggressiveness at the time, of course, by pointing out that the study was now finished with its repairs. The east wing had most of its littered pieces of chipped wood and marble cleaned from the floors and ceiling, and the damage done to the mounted gray wyvern head actually made the once terrifying beast look quite humorous and made his son laugh, so it all worked out in the end. Graphia knew better than to react now, and when she knocked on the door that morning, she held little surprise to hear a lack of response or answering to her beckons. She opened his bedroom door and took a quick glance inward, checking to see if, just maybe, Naruto had simply misheard her or not responded as quickly as he would usually. But as expected, her son was nowhere in his room. Which meant, as was the case for several months now, he was probably with him. Arg, hurrah, ha, yay ya ha, drrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrr the grassy earth, bruised and scathed in several parts of his person as the blow dealt forced his being back. Har har har, is that all you have to show me, little master? Bwah har har. The fire giant Surtur second let out a bellyful laugh as he found himself taking a few steps back, regaining his stature and smiling down to his small student. The rook of the great Satan Lucifer was looking particularly lively in that morning air, with his orange locks fluttering like fire in the cool air's breeze. His usual outfit, a long pair of red cargo pants, vacant of anything resembling a shorter torso cover, was covered in a few marks which might have been an odd mix between grass stains and blood. Oh, but don't worry. It wasn't his blood. The blood actually belonged to his miniature student, who stood now before him with a readied stance. Naruto's lips were cut and swollen, his still-growing figure bruised and roughed up, but still looked ready to continue the grievous exercises Surtur continued to persistently put him through. The human youth had opted for a similar dress to his teacher, with orange-colored cargo pants and a lacking of torso wear. It felt good, as the morning sun of the underworld bathed him in its warm embrace, comforting his minor injuries. It was manly, as Surtur would claim, to forego the confines of a shirt and feel the natural energies of the underworld seep in through all pores of the body. But whereas the giant had a body of muscle-developed strength which made him seem almost like a bodybuilder ready for the Greek Olympics, and had an almost continuous flow of heat and warmth coming from his enormous being, the young blonde instead looked rather tame and skinny next to such bulk. A child, truly, before a beast of a man. A man all too willing to show his ward true hell under his tutelage. Naruto had proven time and time again to be willing to meet his hell with a grin. But now, a pair of cerulean eyes looked to the maker of such boisterous laughs with a hard look. He raised a hand to his cheek, feeling for swelling or signs of blood on his lips. He was clean, but the thought of his being handled so easily left him unamused. Tisk, Hodge, ha, ar, yeah, cree, pow, brag. Again, the boy fell to the ground, harder and more ungraceful than before. His attack ended with but the barest tap of the giant's fist to his nose. Ah, is this all you have to show me? Bwah har har haarrrrrr. A groan was the only answer the younger boy could give the mocking giant. A silent one, followed by his smallish form rising uneasily back to its full height. His blue stared to his teacher's black between the need to catch his breath. Challenging again. HMPH. Kya arrrrrrrr. Boom. Beeg. Again, his short figure fell, looking dazed as something the size of Tyre and as gentle as a wrecking ball pushed into his center, knocking the very air from within. He did not rise so quickly as before. HMPH. As I thought, you're still just my foolish pupil. Ha har har haarrrrrrrrr. This boastful laugh, loud and hearty that the earth itself seemed to quiver at its noise, went on for some moments, disturbing the serenity of the surrounding area. Behind the house of Lucifer is a long and wide area of trees, flowers and glimmering marble steps. Trees with leaves of sapphires and rubies, flowers which changed colors with the wind and the feeling of the sun in the air. Marble steps, long and chiseled and smooth to the touch, showed an insurmountable effort had been placed into their making and placing. Every piece, every inch, and every stage appeared to have been cared for with a graceful touch. No tree was overgrown, no petal whittled or decayed, and every piece of flooring seemed newly sighted and clean. It was a nice little courtyard, used mostly to hold the occasional party or to be marveled at by the visiting envoy, diplomat, or guest. Individuals of many walks found at least a small appreciation to its decoration, design or natural charm. Also, it made an awesome open space for Surtur to drill his lesson plan into his master's son. In particular, one large pasture of cleanly cut grass made a most excellent place for teaching. If you disregarded the bloodstains, the laughing giant, and the child refusing to stay down against said giant's onslaught, it actually was a pleasant spot. When parties were held and parents thought to bring their children to interact with others of their age and rank, most youths would find themselves on the tuft of grass, playing, laughing, and even the occasional roll around, to be particularly entertaining on such a large bit of green. And usually the instigator of such times, the mansion's own youthful resident, could be found amongst them. He was thrilled in his playing, grinning, laughing with the occasional hearty shout of joy, the picture of youth, growing happy. His past glee and delight, however, was like comparing the ocean to an erupting volcano now. The hard, piercing gaze he aimed at his teacher could almost be considered chilling. Unfortunately for the child, however, he looked more akin to a kitten attempting to stare down a tiger, rather than the aged Hokage looking to best a walking inferno. It was sort of adorable in a way, with those eyes only seeming to have the power to excite his teacher further. Yes, that's it, that fire, show me more, yeehaw hhhhhh. And the pattern continued. The boy would attack, the giant would defend himself, perhaps adding insult to injury, then repeat the process. It was a routine Lady Graphia had grown only too accustomed with in the past several months. Walking out onto her patio, stepping lightly on the marble floors, she found herself watching as her boy grit his teeth and continued, time and time again, to launch himself forward. She would watch as his teacher, in no gentle way, push him back to the earth with open palm or closed fist, then await the youth's return. And this is where the stress came, the fighting. The loud smacks of Surtur's hands as they pushed her son back into the ground, leaving often a scrape or bruise. And every time Naruto stood again, Going back at his teacher with a yell or shout, she worried a little more as the pattern repeated for several hours. In the beginning, Graphia would find need to hold herself back when the urge to defend her boy from harm struck her mind. Today she had grown mostly used to this obtuse instruction. Both her child and Surtur seemed only too fond to continue. But honestly, it was debatable if such methods could even be called training. It was an almost barbaric way of teaching, one she could not say she fully approved of, even after so much time had passed. And while of course, by comparison to the giant's true power and strength, the blows dealt were little more than pats or nudges of his hands by comparison, she still held her breath when her child fell to the dirt. Surtur would never do more to harm his master's child. Say what you will of the boisterous rook, but never doubt his love for the Lord Lucifer and, by proxy, the boy he was dutifully training. He was a good man, even with how he presently threw out a kick to stumble the boy back from his continuous attacks. While her opinion of him could be strained, at times, Graphia could admit that he was probably the best to train her young man. Two headstrong individuals. You could almost say it was a match made in heaven, if you ignored the irony of such a statement. Oh, he's so amazing. Look at that hair of his. It's just like fire. Oh, I think I can feel a fire growing in my. And he's so passionate. But he's kind of intimidating, don't you think? But look at those muscles. Oh, and that voice. Oh, and that temperament. Oh. A single silvery eyebrow rose, as Graphia turned her head to the thick trees to her left. Four maids stood hidden behind the thick woods, carefully peering out to watch the pair of boys fight on the grass, talking quietly and with poorly suppressed giggles and moans as they looked longingly towards the large figure of their admiration. This was becoming a familiar sight for the lady of the house. Since the initiation of Naruto's training, a certain crowd of admirers had become a frequent sighting for the silver-haired woman. At first, it had been almost a quarter of the staff, who seemed interested in seeing what sort of training or guidance the heir to the household was receiving. It was a spectacle of gossip, it seemed, as word spread quickly through the underworld that Lucifer's son had begun to train under his mighty and formidable rook. It was a sort of minor gossip, but one which had people wondering on where this guidance would lead. Only time would tell. Anyway, the days passed and the training continued. And eventually, the interest in watching the boy waned, as the mansion's help had duties to uphold. It became more of an occurrence for simply Graphia to stand and watch her son be taught, until she felt need for him to resume his studies in other matters besides the physical. But now and then, such as presently, a few of the housemaids came to perceive Surtur in his large magnificence. Graphia only shook her head when she saw her help looking longingly towards the object of their want. She would not hinder them for their aspirations. A devil was a creature of desires, without question, and lust was unquestionably a desire. If they so wanted the rook, who was she to deny them? However, their wants could wait until the day was finished. Don't you have duties to attend to? She called out pointedly towards them, watching as the maids jumped at her cool voice. Mistress. One of them shouted, quivering under the steely gaze of the head maid. Gg, good morning. Didn't see you there. We were just. She did not seem to find a word to use, waiting for a long, awkward moment to consider a proper response to give to her employer. She couldn't. So instead, the maid bowed deep and quickly then turned and made a quick retreat from the iron look of Lucifuge. Her fellow eavesdroppers mimicked their compatriot, leaving just as swiftly with flustered and embarrassed looks. Graphia, for her part, only shook her head at their antics. This would happen again, she was certain, and again she would command them to return to their duties and remember to have a talk with each of them later. She would be gentle, in her own way. But remembrance of duty sometimes had to come before the idea of carrying out their own, deeply felt wishes. They were young devils and would probably need time to adjust to the idea that obligations needed to come before personal yearnings. But Graphia was patient and more than willing to drill this ideal into their malleable minds. But now, she was left alone to watch her son move about his morning, launching and moving around to fight the larger man. It was good exercise, in a way. Fresh air was always good. If only she could encourage him not to be thrown to the earth so haphazardly. Or to remind him, for the 10th or 11th time, that despite his great size, Surtur was obnoxiously fast for a rook. And, of course, to maybe take a moment's break to eat his morning meal. "I know, Mom," Naruto would tell her, crossing his arms and pouting. "I can handle him. And I'm not hungry. I grabbed an apple, I'm fine." A small apple was hardly a meal with the necessary vitamins and nutrients a growing boy would need in the morning. But she did not argue and instead let him work himself into an appetite. She would prepare him helpings during lunch to make up for it, like always. He was sure to appreciate her then. And so, time passed in the courtyard of Lucifer, with only the sounds of grunts and yells of battle to be heard. Sakura Tree Clearing, Japan. Time remaining: 2 hours, 58 minutes, 12 seconds. There was a great rush of wind and air where the first collision happened. Dust and dirt hovered over the clearing, covering it in a soil-brown fog. A tense ringing in the ears was felt by many of the devils, as the focused pieces of demonic and magical energies collided from both sides with a great sound which shook the earth. No cries of power or shots of energy were given after, as both kings tried to make sense of what would happen next. Sight and sound were thrown into disarray, confusing the parties briefly. Barely could the two groups see their own friends and allies, let alone their enemies. Blind combat was not something wisely fought or practiced even while holed up in the underworld, and so it seemed not a minute into their conflict the two kings had discovered a weakness in themselves. But now was not the time to consider their faults. "Everyone, fall back to the trees. Find cover in the forests. Quickly." Although their vision was skewed, their sense of direction and understanding of where their opponents were remained. Quickly, the two peerages leapt away on quickened feet, jumping into the brush of the tree's natural coverage in the opposite directions of their competitors. Their adversaries' movements were skewed by the still prevalent fog of war, but the same disadvantage lied with their enemies too. Both teams were left blind to the other, and so had their trails were covered and cleared. The rustle of leaves and grass quieted soon after. Shallow and hushed breaths were only just manageable to be heard between them. No one moved or said a word as the dust fell back to the ground or flew off in the wind, leaving the area seeable again. Once their visions were clear again, the next job of finding the other team within the grasses and the trees began. An epic game of "I spy," as it were. But their search for the others was stopped almost as quickly as it began, as someone still stood on the dust-covered clearing. Naruto waited patiently as his vision cleared and sight of the area's surroundings returned. He was smiling and didn't seem particularly bothered by the eruption. His hands were in his hoodie's front pocket, his stance was rather casual and unimposing, and the way his eyes calmly glanced to where the two groups of teens were it almost seemed as if he were amused. I do seem to have lost my friends," he thought aloud, his voice only just hearable from the two sides of the woods and coming off highly entertained. "Well, if there's nothing else to do." He reached one hand from his hoodie, turning it behind himself and reaching towards what seemed to be his back pocket. Instead, he lifted the orange hoodie, only so slightly, and seemed to be reaching for something tucked under his clothes. This action caught the attentions from both parties. His movements seemed to be done in a lapse of speed or urgency, giving everyone a chance to wonder at what this team could have been procuring from outside their views. A weapon. It was the first wonder that came to the teenage minds. It was difficult to say what sort of a weapon could be hidden under a shirt and carried without hindrance, but that didn't mean that open clothes of his didn't hide some secret underneath. A tool, maybe. If not a weapon, a tool could be hidden away for use. Rias personally recalled once where the blonde had tied her up when she snuck into his room when they were younger, using a particularly constricting rope to do so. Wherever he even pulled the rope from, she could not guess, but he seemed rather competent in his ability to restrain her. If not a weapon or tool, then a magical item. Not everyone was so magically adept as a bishop, and nothing remotely magical could be sensed from his backside, but there were items which held their magical capabilities hidden quite well. And with Naruto's ineptitude towards all things arcane, perhaps it would have evened the playing field against the magic casters of both teams. But the thoughts were largely the same from both sides. Whatever was being pulled, it would likely be troublesome in nature. And they weren't exactly wrong. Naruto felt his fingers wrap around the unseen item from behind. His expression visibly brightened at finding a good hold for his fingers around it, then pulled the something around to his front. The item in question, from only what the two parties could tell at first, was rather small as they expected. Maybe just a bit longer than his hand. It could have been held with both hands, barely. It was difficult to tell from where the two parties stood. Being devils didn't mean one had eagle vision. It was slender, too, from what they could tell. Naruto's hand easily wrapped around it. In fact, the closer members could see the item curl itself more tightly from the human's grip. So, it was paper. A rolled-up bit of paper. Colored paper, it seemed. Inked over like a photo, but whatever the image was proved difficult to tell. Wait, no, not paper, it was that's a magazine. Several pairs of eyes stared from hidden places, as tired and hungry minds slowly processed that, yes, Naruto just pulled a folded magazine from his back. Not a weapon or a tool or an item of some prevalence or consideration of warning. Just a magazine. Hua, I guess I'll catch up on some reading. Naruto continued, unaware or, possibly, not caring of the looks he was receiving as he unraveled the curled reading material and without waiting began to wander through its pages with a pleasant air. But, unlike before, it was not the action which surprised his quiet and unseen audience. Rather, it was the picture on the front which gave everyone momentary surprise. A woman was pictured, a young woman, shapely and tan and smiling a smile that practically promised wonderful things to its viewer. A woman with flawless skin and covered in what appeared to be a light bit of water. She might have just come out of the shower, because the only thing she wore was a single, tightly wrapped towel across herself. It hung to her torso like it would never want to be removed, and perhaps this was what it intended, as it did seem to incite a desire and envy from most readers to be said cloth. It hid away only just the bare minimum of the dark-haired youth's body, and only spurred the imagination of many minds. But even through the thin material, to where her breasts lied, two tiny hills pointed outward. Excitement, perhaps, all things coupled together made her seem thrilled, eager, interested, and made just a little bit desiring. All of these things together made a rather compelling front cover. And spurred a number of reactions. With the Grimoire peerage, Asia, laying in front of a small opening in a bush, held a hand to her lips. What are you doing, Naruto-kun? She whispered, confused and aghast. That sort of thing shouldn't be read in public. It's unseemly, and inappropriate. This was about as foul-mouthed as one could expect Asia Argento to get. Ever. But the blood rushing to her cheeks and ears made it somewhat difficult to even consider a worse thing to say, let alone think up. Kiba, kneeling beside her, laughed a little uncomfortably. Well, it's certainly bold, he'd give her that. Let's punch his face in, Kaneko added in, pounding her fists together, riling herself. Her expression looked largely unchanged, but her eyes were narrow and gritted. Some short ways to the side, Ria stood beside her queen. Her appearance, while not necessarily upset, held a certain lack of amusement to finding her cousin perusing such material in her presence. HMPH. Well, that boy has some nerve. Well, he is a growing boy, Bushu, Akano commented, not seeming to even be trying to hold back her mirth or fit of giggles to such a spectacle of an angry heiress and the usually polite, if rambunctious, Uzumaki looking at such reading material. You had to expect this would happen sooner or later. HMHMM. Though, I admit, that sort of publication, it is one of the more daring sorts to pick out. Even Akano felt a little red at seeing such a magazine being shown in public. While she did not read such material, she did hear it was one of the more venturesome reads for anyone to get their hands on. If there was a magazine to check out for a young pervert's mind, Naruto could certainly have done worse. Her king did not seem to appreciate or agree with her assessment, crossing her arms aggressively. If he really wanted to see a woman's body, she shook her head of such thoughts. Now was neither the time nor the place for them. Tell Kiba and Kaneko to get ready, she commanded, turning her attention to Akano, tell them to await my command. We'll get those bells before that idiot even knows what hit him. With the Cetri peerage, what was there to say on the matter of Naruto's reading of such an indecent and relatively offensive supplement of reading? Sona never even considered such an action would be taken. Especially not in public. The boy standing there in the clearing never seemed particularly interested in such a thing, well, save a quick moment a month before, and unquestionably had more guile than to decide to read an inappropriate catalogue of that sorts in front of teenagers. Women, especially in her own peerage, would take offense to such a thing. For example, Sona Sama, her queen, a third-year teen, like her, with a tall and curvy figure, silk-like black hair that ran down as far as her shapely hips, and wearing a similar pair of glasses to herself, whispered into her ear, "I don't mean to sound impertinent, but your friend, he disgusts me." Sona almost laughed. Her queen, the formerly human teen, Tsubaki Shinra, was usually a quiet and well-mannered young woman, who also happened to be a wise and calculative student in her own right. It was what attracted the Cetri heiress into compelling her to be the first member to join her newly formed peerage. Her rather blunt assessment of the boy, now blushing at the material in his hand, was enjoyable. And she did offer a nice second mind whenever she made her first decisions in office. And, admittedly, the young king had a narrowed look which betrayed a lack of amusement when she first made out the front cover. Her hands tightened into fists, noticeable twitch of annoyance developed over her left eye, and her arms crossed over her chest in a way that showed her feelings towards her friend's less than public actions. And indeed, she thought she knew him well. But then, with that notion of familiarity, a curious look crossed over the angered king's features. Sona, admittedly, may not have been as familiar with Naruto Uzumaki as, say, Rias or her peerage, but she thought she knew the boy in her own special way. She'd known him for years, even occasionally looked forward to visiting him whenever she came to see Rias. And not once in their moments together, alone or otherwise, did he direct himself in a manner alike to the present moment. He was always polite, charming, even, in his own, loud way, always smiling and confident and kind. He was no pervert, not like some more outwardly recognized males at Kuo. So, why the magazine? Her features cooled into a more calculative expression, moving a finger to her lips and quietly assessing the present moment while her peerage, in their own ways, began to voice their thoughts on their blonde opponent. What an asshole! Tomo Meguri, Sona's knight, openly growled while throwing an openly malicious glare towards the lone human teen. Her hand tightened around the thick material of her weapon's sheath, looking only too eager to release it. Who does he think he is? Reading that garbage here, degenerate. Ruruko Nomura, the other pawn of the Sona's peerage, in addition to being the youngest member of the student council, fervently nodded with reddened cheeks. Creepo, slime, dummy, she cried her own version of cursing. Scumbag, stupid head, vagabond. Guys, please, calm down. Rei Kusaka, the soft-spoken bishop, spoke tenderly and calmly as her companion's attitudes rose. This isn't so bad. I mean, it isn't good but we need to stay focused. Momo-chan, back me up here. Momo Hanakai, the last bishop of Sona and a second-year beauty with a snowy white complexion to match her equally white hair. She, like Tomo and Ruruko, held a none too pleased look about her as she sent a frigid look towards the human. Trash, was all she said. Rhea seemed less than pleased with her fellow bishops, assistants. Saji-san, please. Saji didn't offer his 2 cents. In fact, he didn't even seem to hear his friend. Instead, his focus seemed to be trying to get a better look at the magazine from his angle. The corner of his lips was curved into a half-formed grin. Rhea stared at him, then her angered compatriots, before dropping her head dejected. It's hopeless. I see that now. While the others seemed either angered, distraught, or even mildly curious in the ways they looked over to the clearing, one of Sona's peerage instead looked mildly amused. I think it's kind of daring. Tsubasa Yura, the lone rook, commented with an all-too-prevalent smirk. Out of her present peerage, Tsubasa always had a way with liking bold or even aggressive actions. It was entertaining, in a way. Very devilish. But Tomo did not share her friend's sentiment. Not even a little. I say we hit him now, she declared, fuming. I mean, just look at him, he's practically drooling on that smut. We'll get him before he even knows we're there. And that's when Sona's eyes perked up. Don't, she commanded, catching the attention of those around her. That's what he wants. She lifted a single finger to her glasses, adjusting them and narrowing her gaze to the relaxed teen. He's goading us, provoking us. The magazine is a ploy. He wants us to attack. Ruruko looked to her king, then to the boy, ogling a particular image, then turned back to Sona. Are you sure? I mean, He may just be a dunce. HMPH. Perhaps. Sona was willing to relent as much, though her mind and gut were telling her otherwise. But for now, we'll proceed with caution. Let Rias make the first move. Turn his attention away from us and see just how ready he is. She turned her eyes toward the teen in the clearing. We'll begin when there's an opening. Tsubaki raised a willowy brow. But Sona-sama, would that not give the other peerage the advantage? The king allowed a small laugh to escape her lips. Oh, believe me, she started, turning to her peerage's wary glances, there's no way Naruto's going to lose those bells so quickly. She allowed her team to mull over her words for a moment, receiving understanding looks and nods from her council, the memory of their blonde opponent's rush of speed still quite vivid in their minds. They were a mostly gifted bunch. A child who went to Kuo Academy had to possess something akin to intellect. And Sona had chosen her servants well. The heiress shook her amusement away before pointing a finger to her queen. It was time for business. Tsubaki, take Tomo and ready yourselves. You're going in first. Tsubaki nodded, turning her attention to the other half of her now formed partnership, who offered her own silent confirmation. Saji, follow after on my command. Provide cover for the two and restrict his movements. Tsubasa, Ruruko, stand by for his defense. Saji raised his hand, absorption line shining only so slightly in the dim light of the trees. Momo, Rhea, we'll provide long-range offense. Try to not hit anyone in the crossfire and don't hold back. Naruto isn't someone to half-ass with. Her bishops offered firm nods, their hands raising and being coated with a dark hue of blue. Sona returned their nods, then looked over her peerage with a cool eye. Everyone has their positions. Any questions? No one spoke. Good. Then spread out. Knowing Rias, she'll make her move soon. Time remaining. 2 hours, 49 minutes, 08 seconds. How do you even bend like that? Naruto stared, fixated and stunned, on another particular image of a woman. Scantily clad just like the others with an all but willing looking in her eyes, he'd been staring at this photo for a few moments now. Seriously, her legs, and her head, it's like, oh. And those elbows, how do they, bones? Does she have bones? The young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, positioned herself in a way that, though just as provocative as the other photos he'd perused, seemed almost impossible to his aged mind. And Naruto, to his credit, had seen many impossible things. But the absurdity of her posture, as if to accentuate her ability to twist herself at the most unusual angles with ease, made him carefully look to every curve of her person, as if to see if what he was looking at was real or not. He was puzzled by the image. Unexpectedly so, he recalled ninjas with less flexibility than this woman. Men and women whose performed feats of strength and power which could make tempered warriors quiver in fear. But never had he seen a body angled in such a way. This image of unusual flexibility was only made more perplexing by how the woman smiled, looking almost happy or elated to be in such a bizarre position. How something so unorthodox could ever be comfortable, the teen didn't even want to begin to understand. It was almost painful to even consider. Even his late wife, a warrior and combatant of astounding flexibility and speed, would have been unprepared or downright incapable of taking such a position. And he'd seen her take on some rather strenuous postures and forms in his life. Forms he certainly could not have taken in his life. This consideration of his past love, however, had a recurring effect of his imagination taking hold, and seeing in his mind his lost love positioning himself like the woman on the page. He could feel his face heated, his own imagination creating quite a picture then. And damn if it wasn't easily 100 times better to his eyes than the magazines. With those legs, her eyes, her lips, her everything. He swiftly averted his view from the image, looking quite red in the cheeks. This might have been the 3rd or 4th time he imagined his wife in the place of the women in the pages. Looking, being positioned, and wearing clothes that she would have never worn even if her life depended on it. He could only imagine how she would scold him if she knew the sort of thoughts going through his head, of course with an equally relatable shade of red to her own cheeks. Sorry honey, he said a silent prayer, looking as apologetic as his crimson-skinned expression would allow, and turned his eyes to sky. Just a little lonely here, that's all. Don't mind me, I love you. Now he was feeling guilty of reading a naughty magazine while thinking of his long-past wife. That's a pleasant thought to have. Not to mention that half the images began to bear an uncanny resemblance to his love after only a few short moments. If he didn't know any better, he'd think she was haunting him, teasing him. Whether it was his wife messing with him from beyond the grave or his own imagination articulating itself in the form of stimulating imagery, the former Hokage didn't want to know, and so then quickly began to move through the catalog's pages again. Though only with a mere fraction of his original attention. Maybe bringing this wasn't the greatest idea, he thought to himself after a few more minutes waiting. Of course, the purpose of the reading material was having the desired effect. Even hidden, he could faintly hear the displeased whispers of upset teens. Their disgust with him was more evident, and their outright intent in wanting to hurt him was practically malleable. He wasn't even certain teenagers would feel anything to his distractive tool. Unlike when he was young in his last life, and when such material showed that his teacher was barely considering him a threat or worth his attention, Naruto couldn't say whether reading porn would elicit a similar reaction or not. Apparently, teenage devils react quite similarly to 12-year-old ninjas. Take that as you will. But then, he found a page more curious than the others. A page which unfolded itself. Curious, he pulled the page out into full length. Like the other pictures, it showed a woman, seductive in appearance and quite beautiful in her own right. She held herself in a confident way, her posture was like others, and looked to have no ill will in showing off her form to the camera which, most likely, had no issue taking as many photo opportunities as it could. And in those ways, this new lady was much like everyone else in the magazine, eye-catching, suggestive, and built like high-class succubi. Nothing really to argue about. And if that were all that made this woman stand out, it might have seemed strange to give such a large page. But there was one difference to her. Unlike her previously viewed magazine compatriots, this model offered nothing in the way of clothing. Her lack of dress was prominent. Full frontal, from the tips of her toes to the top of her head. All her glory, laid out onto that longer-than-average image, and every bit as tan as the rest of her. Naruto actually needed to pull his eyes back from the image, startled by the sudden exposure. While certainly, his village had visual material, which showed off the human body in its glory, and he had still vivid and fond memories being around a beautiful woman lacking in the way of clothing, it had been a long time since he felt the need or want to look into such materials. This showing of such an, admittedly, gifted young woman was, to his eldered mind, an unexpected surprise. One which made his face go a deep crimson and threatened to burst a valve from his nose. His surprised reaction did not go unnoticed. Kiba, Kaneko, go. Out from the forest's edge, the two named teens leapt out, sprinting quickly with sword drawn and fists raised towards their blonde combatant. It was difficult to say what caused the peerage of Grimori to attack first. The sight of Naruto taken aback by what, going off purely his facial expression, seemed like quite the image in his serial, or Ria's reaction to her nephew reacting so dumbfounded to whatever caught his interest. Either the reason, the two devils were on the human in little time, with Kiba reaching his friend first with his superior speed and lashing out with a stab of his sword, aimed at his cheek. Kiba would mull over his initial attack later that evening. Not for the reason of how Naruto avoided his blow by merely tilting his head back, only the barest of distances, to avoid the piercing dash of his attack. Though that would be part of his silent pondering. Rather, it was by how the boy did not even seem to feel the need to even glance over to his coming assailant, still looking quite dazed by whatever caught his attention. Kiba felt only the air pass by him as he soared forward and landed away from his opponent, quickly readying himself for another attack. Kaneko came quickly after. Her attack, a leap into the air with a fist drawn back to drive down on her opponent's position, missed without issue. Naruto, this time, only took a long step back to avoid the aggressive blow from the ashen-haired teen, whose considerable strength left a sizable mark into the earth. But her assault was unfinished. Naruto was within distance, so Kaneko leapt again, a driving left hook directed to his chest. But again, her attack missed. Naruto crouched to the earth, leaving Kaneko to pass over his lowered form. And still, he didn't meet their eyes or acknowledge their presence, instead deciding to take a deep breath, as if calming himself, and return to his reading. If intentional or not, it was hard to say. But Naruto was, if even perhaps unintentionally, toying with the knight and rook of Grimoire. Kaneko was not one to express annoyance outwardly. Neither was Kiba. The younger teen preferred to use her words, harsh though they might have been, to declare her mood. Kiba simply moved past his emotions and straightened himself for any sort of conflict, as his experiences in the underworld had taught him. He kept himself cool and focused. Emotion would not graze his features. But right then, both teens held narrowed looks. A devil's pride was not something so easily challenged. Kiba dashed forward, his sword held high and prepared to cut down his friend. Kaneko launched herself once more, this time with a leg brought wide, prepared to send it forward to smash into the man's ribs. They came from his front and back, moving as fast as they were, unflinching in their followed instruction to destroy their opponent. And again, Naruto stared down to his reading material, turning a page with a single finger as the distances between the sword and the leg closed. FWOOSH. Shing. Kaneko's leg went wide, knocking a wave of air out from the sheer weight of her blow, making an audible noise. Kiba was different. His sword only just missed the smooth skin of her leg before swiftly embedding its tip into the dirt floor beneath them. Debatable, though it might have been, to say if the rook's skin would feel anything from such a tool, it was not something the knight felt needed to be tested on her leg of all things. The moment after the first assault was quiet and still. As what might have seemed unsurprising at that point in the morning, Naruto again was not to be found between the two teens. Their quickened actions hitting not their target but instead a small gathering of leaves which appeared unexpectedly between them. By the sheer power behind the kick of the young Kanekos, several of the green plants shivered in the air, while the dark sword of Kiba managed to cut down several of the viridian specks into spectacular halves. Where this foliage appeared from, not even those watching from the corners of the woods could answer. The question of where the disappearing teen was, however, proved easier to answer. The sound of ruffled paper was easily heard over the silence of the clearing, with several eyes turning towards the noise to see the blonde once again reading the magazine without issue or noticeable care. Furthering the surprise of those watching, there happened to be a sizable gap between himself and his two friends, the distance traveled in that short instant somewhat startling to all viewers. His expression of interest towards whatever he was viewing remained, as was his stunning lack of awareness to the world around him. Kiba stared over to his friend. "He's fast," he muttered, mostly to himself, as he straightened himself back to full height. "Keep up the pressure. We'll smash his shit," Kaneko returned, slapping her fist into her open hand with a resounding pop in the clearing. As entertaining as circumstances would have it, Naruto's eyes widened at the sudden noise from the girl's person, turning his attention away from the pages in surprise and towards his friend's aggressive stares. He seemed confused by their gazes for only a brief moment, then simply lifted his hand and gave a kindly wave to the two, not seeming to have a care or worry in the world. This had the, perhaps desired, effect of inciting further ire from the two servants of Grimoire. But as this all happened, a pair of twin steel flashed behind his person, held by two slim figures descending down from the blue sky. The sharpened edge of weapons fell, aimed and hoping to meet the human's unguarded back. Sona would compliment her queen and knight on their timely attack later that evening. Their decided time to strike could not have been more apt. Naruto was distracted, his back was turned, he only just avoided an attack from both sides with an admitted ease which proved startling to even herself. His passive methods of taking on a devil's trained rook and knight were in no way easy feats, and although the Sea Tree King was all too aware that the boy was by no means an ordinary or incompetent fighter, the absolute ease by which he proved his superiority over Rias Peerage was both startling and admittedly amusing. Tsubaki and Tomo fell behind the youth in the moment after his quick escape. They came down on him with speed and stealth, barely seeming to be anything more than shadows as they leapt towards his unprotected rear. And in that moment, Sona found herself quite pleased, believing this first attack would be an appropriate first step to her plan. Of her peerage, it was an unquestionable fact that Tomo held the advantage of speed to herself, surpassing even her queen. Her skill in close combat, especially with her armament of choice, a broadsword bequeathed to her by Sona, forged by devil smiths and produced at high monetary cost, made her a formidable combatant. Particularly when considering her history and familiarity with the Academy's Kendo Club. Tomo was almost a shoe-in for the next club president, and before her involvement in the council, seemed all too eager to take up the mantle once their current president moved on to university. But the presidential position of a club like Kendo seemed inappropriate for someone of her spirit and talent. It took some time, but Sona managed to convince her knight that her place on the student council would open doors which she never knew even existed. The Cetri heiress found her convincing to be one of her proudest and most capable moments in her life. And as for Tsubaki, her history and competency with the polearm known as the naginata, a familiar weapon of feudal Japan, was without issue or complaint. As fate would have it, Sona's queen was a part of a rather traditional family which held practices and conducts which dated back several centuries. One of which happened to be the use and handling of the old weapon. Since before she could even run, the youth Tsubaki was given instruction in the finer and formal methods of conduct befitting her station within the household. Her proficiency in all aspects taught to her were quickly recognized and applauded, as was her exceptional skill with the polearm. With her mind, maturity, elegance, trained physique and her distinct knowledge of the weapon, Tsubaki proved to be a formidable servant as both an intellectual and a woman of exceptional close-quarter capability. The Cetri girl was pleased with her choices. Tsubaki and Tomo would do well for her first move. To the credit of the Cetri peerage's unseen attack, Naruto actually found that he needed to put more effort into its avoidance than his previous efforts required. Whereas before his sheer speed and lackluster efforts in evading the initial strikes of his friendly foes had proven more than sufficient, the quick moves of the Cetri queen and knight proved to necessitate a bit more work and less finesse than his previous movements. If only a little, at least. Naruto leapt high from his held spot in the clearing. The two steel weapons fell to the now vacant spot of their intended target, marking the earth where he stood. The two girls lifted their heads to follow their human opponent as he hung in the air, with Tomo cursing their failed efforts. Hiba watched this all take place with a quickened mind and plan. Taking advantage of this sudden movement skyward, and the opponent's inability to fly or move, the knight launched into the air with sword drawn wide, dark and leathery wings jutting from his back as the distance narrowed between himself and Naruto. His eyes met Naruto's, who did seem not as ready and willing to read so casually at that moment, and brought his weapon wide towards his unguarded arm. But of all methods that might have been available for the former ninja to use in getting out of his airborne situation, it was to Kiba's unexpected dismay that it was perhaps the most ridiculous of methods he could have used. Naruto used his hand to open the magazine wide, showing to the young devil only the briefest image of a girl without a top on. He held the opened publication out towards the incoming sword, looking as if using the reading material as a shield to intercept the sword. Hiba appeared questioning the unusual move but still followed through with the swing, letting his blade's edge graze into the open and waiting maw of the opened book. He regretted it only a few seconds later. The sword only just began to press against the insides of the seemingly makeshift shield before the top and lower parts of the magazine slammed shut, closing in around the edged weapon by tightly gripping fingers. The forward motion of the weapon ceased, cut off as if it had been knocked into the side of a mountain, which then proceeded to engulf the tool into itself and refuse it any chance of being released. It was a simple action. A quick one, in less than moments' time. Hiba's eyes could only widen. Even his forward direction had somehow been stopped. His surprise strike concluded by his opponent. He looked to how the magazine held his weapon so, kept in place between paper, ink, and a few fingers. It didn't seem possible. In fact, it almost seemed silly. A common store and household item, not used as a weapon against anything more than the occasional smiting of a lowly spider or insect, had rendered his blade useless. It was enough to make his expression go pale at the mere thought of what might occur next. He followed those fingers to their owner, eventually reaching the pair of eyes staring at him. Those large blues were something he'd seen for many years now and had seen many emotions in them. This unwavering edge was no different. But the only time he'd seen them like this were towards his opponents. Foes, enemies, towards people he fought with vigor and intention. The last time he saw such a look, they were aimed at the black-feathered fallen the night he rescued Asia. Such eyes were never directed towards his friends. Never towards Kiba. And that's when the servant of Grimori discovered, with a cold chill trailing down his spine, that his friend was not pretending to ignore them anymore. That now, Naruto Uzumaki was taking this challenge with some seriousness. And the knight found himself wishing that he wouldn't. The human's next move was a simple one. He pulled the sword back, drawing his fellow blonde towards him. His free arm went to the devil's shoulder, pressing down. At first, gently, barely a hold, but then it grew harder, rougher, more aggressive, digging fingers into clothing and into the skin below and muscles below them. It quickly became a pain of increasing agony, bring a quick loss of breath and control over his composure. His grip on his sword weakened until it fell from his hand, his face contorted in pain, and his form wavered in the air. Astounding how so much could happen in the moment of an earthly second. But still, it was not over. Like a dam breaking under the strain of the water it held, the pressure rose to unprecedented heights, forcing the very control of Kiba's flight out from his person with a harrowing cry. His wings went wide and stiff, their control now gone and unable to maintain his pattern in the air. The knight found that the pull of gravity and rough pressing down of Naruto's hand would no longer be ignored, and with one final shove from the aggressive fingers of his opponent, he was sent downward with an unprecedented force to the earthly floor. And so, the devil fell. With the Grimoire peerage. Rias watched as Kiba made to strike down his opponent. Watched as her nephew took advantage of the attack. Watched as only what seemed to be a simple grab and throw sent her knight falling to earth, landing without any sort of grace and lifting a cloud of dirt to hover over where he now laid. It didn't seem particularly brutal. Quick, yes, but not so brutal. And yet, Kiba did not rise up so quickly as she might have hoped. Only the silent movement of his chest and the grunts of discomfort offered her any clue that her servant would be fine. Kiba-kun, Asia yelled, foregoing all manner of stealth and tried to move to his position. There were tears at the corners of her eyes. Kiba-kun, get up. Get up. Kiba-kun, please. Akeno quickly reached out to stop her, grabbing hold of her wrist and looking stern. Asia-chan, don't. He's hurt, she cried. He's hurt. I have to help him. I have to. He'll be fine, Rias said, her voice sharp and aimed towards her frantic bishop. Kiba still breathes. I did not choose a weakling for my knight, Asia, you would do well to remember that. Her gaze turned away from her collapsed knight and fell on Asia for a moment, making sure to show that her command for her stillness was not a request, but an order. He will rise. Quickly, I am sure. Kiba-kun is far too stubborn to be taken out so easily this early in the game. Asia stared at her king for only a moment, looking conflicted by both her wanting to help her friend and the order of which she had been given. She did nod, eventually, understanding why she was being refrained before turning back to the battle at hand. Her face still appeared panicked and concerned, her hands went up in a way as if she were ready to pray, but hesitated in a curious way to wonder if praying for her fellow devil would have the same effect as it had on herself. It would probably do no good to give her friend a holy shock while he laid on the ground, unquestionably in some pain. Rias, for a quiet moment, acknowledged how her commanding presence did indeed get the results she desired from the timid bishop. Something she was sure her father would have praised her on. But perhaps, she would admit, her words came off as a bit harsher than intended. Particularly when she considered how her servant was still a young, untested and unquestionably pure former nun now looking to one of her few friends being dealt with in such a quick and aggressive manner. Her experience in situations such as the one were undoubtedly was limited. She did not understand yet that emotions must sometimes be quelled so that victory must be achieved. The Crimson King told herself she would apologize later for her words. She could offer as much. But for now, there was a battle which needed to be won. And already, her mind began to plot her next move, now taking into consideration the Queen and Knight of Citri. Akeno quietly released her grip from the girl and gave her attention fully into the battle. Her expression was not its usual smile, instead now taking in every detail she could over the surrounding area. Unlike Asia, she understood what it meant to see conflict, how to survive and triumph over tribulations that occurred, how to turn troubles and problems into advantages and benefits, to move past the hell that came with struggle and push forward with whatever situations came after. By that sense, her lessons had created an astounding queen, ready for the raiding games. But above all those lessons, Akeno instilled within herself a sense of desire in her needing to wallow in the absolute bliss which came with conflict. To enjoy every moment by which how her opponents suffered for their transgressions, whether they be through straying from their masters or merely thinking to challenge her majestic self. She made sure that whatever happened, her personal being would be elevated by the experience. Either through the pain induced onto her opponents, or the agony brought onto herself, Akeno would wear a smile which spoke volumes of her enthrallment of the moment. And even now, a small part of her found the way by which Naruto handled those around him with a mocking ease to be invigorating. Time remaining: 2 hours, 43 minutes, 15 seconds. There were assumptions from the devil teams to what might have happened next. Perhaps a few included a look of a cool, focused, and outwardly intimidating Uzumaki, whose no-nonsense appearance struck at the hearts of the young teenagers around him. Possibly there was an anticipation of blunt, hard words that would have pained the ears and crippled the spirits of those in attendance. Or perchance there was the possibility of a looming visage standing over the frightened devil. The human's piercing eyes promising no end of torments or misery, and his clenched fingers all too willing to induce and prolong such promises of pain. After such a showing of control over the teens, done so in a way which showed an almost professional subtlety and lacking in any sort of error, the ideas behind what would happen next were as uncomfortable as they were limitless to imagine. Many expected to see the true ability of the son of Lucifer, in all his fearsome capability. The reality of the situation, however, proved different. Oh crap, oh crap, oh crap, oh crap, oh crap, oh crap, oh crap. Naruto had his hands in his hair, looking terrified as he looked down at his friend. I went too far. Oh, crap, I went too far. It wasn't supposed to happen that way. Well, not entirely that way. He expected his nudge to do damage, remove the sword from the equation, and send his fellow blonde to the earth in rough manner. Bring him to his knee. Stagger him. Not, belly flop him. And the way the dirt lifted from his impact, that was not a gentle landing. And, as if he were adding insult to literal injury, Naruto landed with a recognizable grace and unperturbed step. Not even seeming to disturb the grass under his feet. Quite the contrast to the devil boy, who still didn't seem capable of moving from the earth. He breathed still, which was good. Even from where the former Hokage stood, he could see as much. But it was slow, pained. Kiba, Naruto called out. No response. Kiba, you alright? Again, nothing, not even a twitch. The human turned, expecting to see something of a reaction or sign of worry from those around him. But the reactions he saw were off. Kaneko did not move from her spot, watching him with fists raised, ready to attack if needed. Say what you will of the Rook, but she and Kiba were tight. Naruto expected, at least, to see even a small sign of worry. Not this absolute, I'm about to kick your ass look she was supporting. Where was the love? And Tsubaki and Tomo were no different, lifting their weapons into forms, showing their readiness. Sure, they were the opponents to the Grimoire house, but nothing even remotely in the way of caring for the down boy. It came off as somewhat harsher than Naruto expected. Kiba, sit tight, he spoke again, walking towards the prone body. I'm gonna get you over to Asia. Shield. He froze. Shrink. Naruto felt his senses jump before the sound even reached his ear. His eyes shot downward as a single strip of steel protruded from the earth, quickly shortening the distance between its sharpened point and his head. His face betrayed the obvious surprise he felt as the metal came towards him, his own instincts pulling his head to the side to avoid the steel as it ascended another foot or so past his gold locks. He grit his teeth, feeling only the tiniest bits of his blonde hair being grazed but thankfully avoiding all semblance of skin. He would have counted himself lucky, except for the sudden shrink, which came after. Another slender piece of steel aimed for his head. Another, of similar make and look, rose towards his chest. Naruto managed to tip his head back further to avoid the first strike, and leaned his body back in an angle which only just avoided the last sword from touching his clothes. He would have counted himself fortunate still, but the back of his mind shouted for a retreat. And so, he did. And not a moment too soon. Shrink. The several blades of steel rose swiftly and in greater numbers, all aiming to where only Naruto was just the moment before. They came more frequently then. Head, stomach, arms, legs, no area was without intent of being pierced. His teenage form leapt back several times to avoid where these various weapons from the underground began to leap out at him, keeping pace with his fleeing form. His eyes kept to where the weapons rose, dancing through the clearing, only managing a small moment in between to turn his focus to where his old friend laid. Kiba's form was still laying to the ground, but his head was now raised, gray eyes following his movements. He was smirking, his brimming confidence unsettling, and in his hand, plunged deeply into the dirt, what seemed like only the smallest of swords in existence. Silver-bladed and short-handled, it seemed to be little more than a dagger by its size. And the way it was pushed so deeply into the soil, the handle was only just seeable now from where Naruto leapt to avoid the eruption of further blades. Ah, now I see, Naruto thought as he continued to weave around sword after sword which jutted from the earth. Sword birth. I should have expected that. Sword birth. The sacred gear belonging to the Devil Knight, Yuto Kiba. Also recognized under the title of Demon Sword Creation. Sword birth is a rather simple sacred gear, in that its purpose and functionality is almost given in its name. Sword birth offers its user the ability to produce swords from almost nothing. And this is no short emphasis on the word, lots of them. Potentially hundreds, based entirely around what the possessor is capable of thinking of and producing it through sheer use of mental and magical force. And these swords imagined could stretch almost beyond believable capability. Swords which eat light, devour fire, and produce effects only the rarest of magical or arcane items could even begin to possess. The sword birth is only limited by what the user is capable of imagining, understanding, and possessing the magical fortitude to conjure the weapons they think up. With the obvious downside being based around the effect desired, more energy and power would be required to maintain its form. And if its user was mentally insufficient or distraught while using what weapon that was summoned forth, then the weapon would be as weak as its master. Sword birth has been used by some of the greatest warriors throughout human history: Charlemagne, Miyamoto Musashi, William Wallace. Their prowess in battle lived on through the ages, and each of their prized weapons were forged by their imagination to suit their needs without fault. They, however, were not men of remarkable arcane ability. Their true potential in using sword birth was, by extension, quite limited to making simple constructs. But even in their limited capacity, they were recognized for their craft and fighting prowess for centuries after. Kiba was, as fate would have it, the first devil to possess the sword birth since its creation. And his magical abilities, though not to the levels of bishops or similarly magical beings, was still of a far more notable capacity than the sacred gear's predecessors. He was expected to do great things. Over the years, Kiba expanded on his use of sword birth. Studying it, practicing with it, consulting with himself on the true nature behind just how far the gear's full capabilities could be pushed. Hours upon days upon months of grueling exercise were put into unlocking its potential. To drive himself forward, beyond what many believed possible for someone of such a young age. And where once, it was believed that the sacred gear could do little more than reconstruct the imagery of a bladed weapon from one's mind into reality, leaving sword birth's wielder weary and worn from its conjuring. Now, its potential seemed vastly more, as the Knight of Grimoire decided to effectively give such beliefs the middle finger while calling forth dozens of blades of different sizes, capabilities and uses, with barely the need to even raise a finger. Their very creation marking whatever moment he saw fit best to use them for. And with his educated person, he found himself adept at producing a weapon to suit whatever the situation called for in the blink of an eye. He was not simply a genius by basis of education, but by combat as well. But the current technique which now pressed the young Uzumaki back was not the simple projection of sharpened steel which sword birth became famous from. Rather, this bladed ability was of a more unique variety. A resulted development from Kiba's intensive training in the underworld. By driving his blade into the surface of the earth and channeling his demonic power through the weapon, he discovered this new technique by pure coincidence and nearly made himself into a devil-sized pincushion for his troubles. Powered by his will and control over the energies within, Kiba could expand and duplicate his weapon by almost the hundreds, giving his close-ranged abilities a much-needed long-ranged skill. Dozens of blades coursed underneath the earth at quickened speeds and unseen by the average eye. Its potential was certainly startling for the unsuspecting party. It might have even been considered genius, if Kiba wasn't so modest as to shrug and laugh off such declarations with an inspiring modesty. Fittingly, he would go on to bequeath the name of this new technique as the sword eruption, as per suggestion by the teen he was now trying to skewer. Speaking of, shrink, 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 shrink. The blades continued to rise from the earth, making something of a field of swords out of the once pleasant clearing. The sounds of their coming were loud and somewhat unpleasant as they grinded against one another, and the grass beneath them were unruffled and torn from their roots, barely capable of hindering the sharpened steel. And all the while, Naruto stepped back, only ever moving just enough to avoid the oncoming swords. Casual, unafraid, his attention was kept towards the earth, as sword eruption continued to make havoc across the open field. His movements were enough to keep out of range of the technique, and even with the time seeming to pass quite slowly, the actual length of the moment from which Kiba initiated his own technique was actually quite short. Perhaps 30 seconds, just under a minute, somewhere in that field of time. Avoiding the scathing metal made counting the moments difficult. Taking care of one's life by the mere blink of an earthly second made time seem as if to slow in anticipation for the next attack. But the human was mostly certain little time had passed, even if the moment felt longer. Shrink. Another sword escaped from the ground, avoided again as Naruto tilted his head back and made another short leap back from where the multitude of metal began rising from the earth. He would only be given a moment's peace before he would need to move again. But in that small moment, he turned his eyes over to the user of sword birth. And what he saw did not surprise him. Kiba now stood from where his previous down position was. His hand still held the sword he plunged into the earth, but now it was not as deeply pressed as before. Just enough to ensure his technique work. But his form was slouched. The grip on his weapon was looser than was normal for him. And from his hard expression a small bit of sweat began to smoothly fall down his brow. His breathing became slow and tired, looking only too ready then to fall to a crouch and regain some form of energy that was sorely lacking from his person. But still, he persisted in his attack. But for how long, Naruto could not say. Sword eruption required a significant amount of energy to sustain, more so than the simple producing of blades of which Kiba was familiar with. In addition, sword eruption required a procured weapon to be pierced into the earth, a rather showing detail of the move to anyone familiar with its use, and the spawning blades from beneath the earthly floor could only move a certain distance away from its wielder. A telling move with limited reach and costly to one's stamina. Naruto admittedly noticed how the blades began to slow in their pursuit as time passed and the distance between Devil Knight and human furthered. Their protrusions became more scattered, their eruption speeds dulled, and fewer blades began to rise from in front of him. The only conclusion he could guess was that Kiba was beginning to tire, which might have seemed odd to anyone watching, as his proficiency with sword birth was vast and with many years of experience in its use. Previous experiences even dictated his ability with such a technique, though fairly new to his arsenal, was more proficient than the present showing and should not have tired him so quickly. Perhaps the blow from the air to the earth had drained him more than he let on. Or perhaps it was the weariness of the day and the lack of food which began to eat away at his endurance. Devils did possess remarkable stamina, but even still, their need for rest and nourishment could come as very human to others. I guess this is his limit, Naruto thought with a noticeable frown, taking a long leap backward as a few blades rose to attack him again. I should focus on getting the others out here. Give him a moment to rest in. He froze again, just as his leg touched down to the earth. A series of sounds from behind made his eyes go wide again. Shrink, shrink, shrink. He tilted his gaze towards his rear. 3 swords were already halfway to his back. Shrink, 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 shrink. His expression turned a little more surprised, turning his focus back to his front. More swords. They narrowed the distance between their pointed edges and himself with a remarkably higher speed than before. And they came from the back and front. 2 directions, separated from the single group. This was new. Naruto was not aware Kiba was capable of producing 2 different oncoming sword eruptions. Nor did he expect such a trap from the usually proud and straightforward knight. Could that have been what was straining him? Controlling 2 eruptions, via 1 sword. Controlling 1 alone proved strenuous, but 2. And so secretively. The knight was improving. Good, Naruto thought, taking a moment to silently praise the boy who was actively trying to kill him. You've surprised me, Kiba. Okita will be pleased. The human actually allowed a smile to cross his face even as he once more leapt high over the field and out of the blade's reaches. Again, he found himself far above his opponents, staring down to where the four members stood as they returned his glances back pointedly. Except for Kiba, his eyes weren't that of careful observation. Rather, he looked to almost be pleased by how Naruto had risen far above the earth. Mirthful, even, to know that his move had sent the boy skyward, yet again. Kiba's mouth began to open wide, and that was when Naruto realized the swords weren't the trap. The sky was. Everyone! Kiba shouted loudly, raising his sword from the earth and pointing it to the airward human. Move, now! Oh, nice! Tsubaki and Tomo were both airborne before Naruto could register the dark wings coming from their backs. The space between them was cut quickly, their weapons brought wide and poised to strike. The queen, a stab of her naginata. The knight, a slash from her sword. Naruto viewed these movements with a careful eye. There were several ways to avoid such attacks. Easily, in fact, but in that mid-air moment, he felt curious. Curious at what this joint attempt at his life would achieve, and to see how such an unplanned attack would perform. He was something of an expert at unplanned movements, after all. And so, he let the attacks come. The polearm came first and proved hardly troublesome. The weapon was aimed for his arm, perhaps with the aim of crippling or dismembering it from his body, but was found to be easily avoided by simply lifting said arm over the weapon to let it pass unimpeded. The ninja's hand caught the pole of the weapon after, disabling whatever follow-up attack the peerage queen had planned as he refused to let go, and thus eliminating the first threat. Tomo's sword was only slightly more difficult. She was in range of a good kick to the jaw, if he so wanted, but settled instead with aiming the heel of his sandal into the guard of her weapon, stopping its momentum with minor effort and not even needing to waste a hand. He watched the two again, this time expecting at least some sort of emotion on their faces. But again, all he received was hardened looks. Before he could even be curious, a dark shadow came over him, blocking out the sun. His eyes flew overhead to see the small figure of Kaneko, arm brought wide and diving forward into the air to reach his person. Naruto's eyes followed her, a relatively powerful rook looking to do some aerial damage, assisted by the force of gravity. That could do some harm. Naruto reacted as only his trained body knew how, bringing his only free hand close to his chest, bending a few fingers while keeping a few pointed long, and focused quickly. Poof! A burst of smoke appeared behind himself. Admittedly, this did have a surprising effect on the Seitree servants, who did not have the experience with Naruto's talents, as the Grimoire. The Uzumaki, for his part, did not even acknowledge their bewilderment with a response, instead feeling a strong arm reach out from the sudden smoke and wrap its hard fingers around the back of his clothes. Naruto did take a moment to watch as the queen and knight's eyes reflected the image behind him. What appeared to be, as only they felt was an apt word to use in this situation, a replica of the boy had moved his fingers to the back of its originator's clothes and took hold of them roughly. The doppelganger then twisted himself, pulling his double with him, and threw him towards the earth as fast as he was able. It was a strange sight for them. Not so much for Kaneko, who was familiar with his doppling, and so continued her descent unfazed. And although unable to pound the daylights out of her original target, the young devil did manage to strike the top of the duplicate's head with a mighty swing of her tiny fists. Poof! Similar to how it appeared, the double vanished in a bit of smoke, leaving the space without any sort of sign that it had been occupied a moment before. This was unusual for the Seitree team. The queen and knight, closest to the happenstance of Naruto's latest avoidance, looked positively flabbergasted. Kaneko, on the other hand, looked definitively unamused as she landed to the earth. I hate it when he does that. Naruto skidded on the clearing's dirt floor without real issue. The distance between himself and the teens was significant now, and neither devil parties seemed overly intent on resuming their quick assaults. Kiba was tired, holding himself up by his sword and panting lightly. Kaneko was already settling back into a comfortable form of her choosing whilst looking slightly peeved at her failed attack's execution. And the Seitree girls, though looking weary and now clearly aware of their opponent's prevalent capabilities, readied themselves mid-air. Okay, right, devils can fly, jumping bad, probably should remember that. If he had a choice, he would take those already airborne last. By now, it would make sense for them to become aware of his lack of mobility mid-flight. A fact, Naruto was certain, more members of both peerages would only be too eager to take advantage of. It was these thoughts that rang loudly in his mind as he began to straighten himself from his unorthodox avoidance of Kaniko's descending strike, feeling the bells at his waist chime lightly from his movements. The past several minutes were understandably noise-filled and quick, he almost forgot they were there. But he supposed he would have to keep better track of them now, it would not do well to forget. As fate would have it, however, in that moment between his planning and his consideration of the bells and his meaning to stand tall again, where he heard the shift of air and the moving of a quick something from behind. A few moments before, Saji carefully moved through the wooded area surrounding the clearing with quiet breath and careful step. His eyes were careful as they made certain to take note of the blonde still casually moving in the clearing's area, while also making sure to avoid the dry twigs and leaves scattered around. Perhaps it was simply his paranoia getting the best of him, leaving him to believe that even a single misstep would end his silent navigation as he moved to get behind his target. But he was not alone. Ruruko moved alongside Saji while making their way through the bushes and around the trees, complaining only lightly as her outfit was smudged with the light brown of dirt and harsher, darker color of mud. She held her waist-length pigtails in one hand, hoping that they would otherwise avoid the dirtied surfaces of the woods, but despairing every moment her fellow council member continued his trek forward. She did not want him to see her like this, muddied and gross and disturbed by her surroundings. And the bugs, oh, it was embarrassing. The pawn would have liked nothing more than to have waited by her king, but understood her orders. She did not want to disappoint her upperclassmen, especially the one leading her forward, so instead continued to wade through the nature around with a grimace. Her fellow compatriot and Rook, in contrast, seemed almost elated with the way things were happening. Tsubasa found this whole challenge to be most enjoyable experience, and only seemed to gradually prove more so, by the minute. Sure, Tsubasa was as tired and hungry as the rest of her team. She definitely felt a little drool pass down her lips after smelling the delectable foods which hid behind their opponent's bag, but was of a more positive emotion to the current happenings around the clearing which neither the damp trees nor the earthly muck could dull. In fact, it was rather the opposite. The prospect of getting down and dirty was only helping to excite her further. The Seatree Rook happened to be the 8th child of her family and the lone girl to be born from the Yura household. And having been raised alongside 7 older brothers, Tsubasa took after their more aggressive and reckless attitudes than maybe her parents would have otherwise liked. Mud wrestling, kickboxing, sumo wrestling, she loved it all. She was barely even able to walk or form words in her mouth before her oldest was teaching how to chokehold someone into unconsciousness, using her brothers as guinea pigs to her adorable amusement. By the time she reached high school, Tsubasa was all but ready to join the academy's disciplinary squad. And might have excelled under the position, had Sona not offered her a second option. But anyway, Tsubasa did keep an eye on Naruto as he fought against the 4 devils. More out of concern for if she and her party would be caught in their movements by a sideways glance on his part, but also out of curiosity to how he moved. Being a Rook meant she was made for the front lines. She held little doubt she would be needed in challenging this opponent soon. The thought of getting up close and personal to Naruto gave something of a cheer to her person. She was of a tomboy attitude, as she and many of Kuo Academy would openly acknowledge, so the thought of going all out on someone like the human teen was somewhat appealing to her. She watched as Kiba was tossed to the floor with his attack failing via magazine. Observed how, by seemingly light effort, the Uzumaki avoided the rising metal which sprang from the ground soon after, looking as if only mildly distracted by the knight's assault rather than concerned for its capability in flaying his flesh. Or how now, as he leapt into the air, Tsubaki and Tomo met him head-on and were handled without so much as a look of discomfort or worry. He might as well have been reading his provocative material again, for all that the 4 teens had accomplished. But then the moment came after, where to the surprise of Saji and his group, a double of the human appeared out of thin air to assist in his avoidance of the human wrecking ball that was Kaniko. Their surprise only lasted momentarily as the boy was flung by his poofed-up partner, landing with a sharp skid on the ground. The distance between himself and the 4 devils was significant now. Tactful, no way any of them would get the drop on him now. But the distance between Saji and the human was now considerably lessened. The servants of Sitri stood still, none daring to make a move. Their breath halted in their lungs while their toes curled in anticipation. Their orders were to wait until called. Saji had his gear ready and waiting to be used, positioning himself. From their point in the woods, they were hidden, but the distance for which absorption line could be used was short. They would need to come out from their place, quickly, and attack the boy before he could make himself aware. Risky did not begin to describe their plan of attack now. Sona would know this. She was brilliant like that. But still, when would Saji get a better opportunity to use his gear than now? Sona would also know this. Naruto began to straighten himself. It was all happening so slowly, so enticing was his open back. Defenseless. Ruruko's fingers shook. Tsubasa's lips stretched wide in an anticipating smirk. And Saji swallowed a load of something which stuck to the back of his throat, his job the most important. The moment needed to happen now or all of their planning would fumble. And Sona knew this. A cobalt-colored glyph appeared, no thicker than paper and just as wide as Saji's hand, beside the male pawn's ear. The whisper of his king made its way to his ear, offering only a single, soft word to him. Go. The three leapt from their place of hiding, moving into the clearing. Tsubasa stood on guard, Ruruko beside her. Saji took to their back some feet behind, lifting absorption line and aiming towards the blonde human. Absorption line, Saji called out, feeling the suction of his gear forcefully take hold of his demonic power, preparing itself in a quickly manner. Almost as if it were alive. Attack. The sacred gear responded to the command. The twin violet jewels which seemed to make up the black gauntlet's eyes lit with an almost fiery glow, alighting his arm in a glow of indigo. From the point of his arm, the gauntlet cracked itself in half only a small bit, revealing a hole in its design that wasn't so clear to see as before. It almost seemed as if it were a mouth, by the way of its design seeming like a face, as a bright sapphire light escaped its lips. From the mouth shot a line of rope of deep cyanic coloring, almost as if it were made of thickened light. More like to a tongue jutting from the mouth of a lizard, the streak of shining blue moved past its own mouth, past its wielder's two guards, and shot through the air towards the unwary human. Naruto did not seem to be aware of the attack as it came, even as the blue glow of absorption line's tongue arced itself under his arm, around his torso, and then around his back. This action made quick work of wrapping itself twice around the human's chest, going taut and unyielding in its hold. Almost as if the rope were suctioning itself to the boy's clothes. Bright blue eyes widened as he now seemed aware of whatever force now caught himself in its hold, turning his head around with a panicked look across his face. Saji allowed his lips to curve into a successful grin. Now, absorption line, restrain, he commanded again, feeling the gear respond in its own way. The line which held its opponent turned a darker shade of blue, looking less like glowing neon and more like cobalt stone. Almost as if it was hardening from its dark gauntlet towards its trapped human. Naruto actually tried to struggle from its grip, but to no luck. The wrapping held tight, seeming to pass its power of hold through his person. His legs felt tight and uncompromising, twitching as if willing themselves to struggle and move but otherwise disobeying their owner's commands. A similar coloring of dark blue came over his legs, the demonic energy of Black Dragon's pulse unyielding in its now vice-like grip. The boy was stuck. I got him, Saji yelled. He could see Tsubaki and Tomo stiffen in the air, their weapons already poised and their bodies leaning forward in movement. He did not need to give them the order, as they flew forward on dark wings towards the immobilized youth. Said boy saw their coming with alarm. But the servants of Sitri were not alone, for underneath Sona's queen and knight the lone swordsman of Grimori sprinted. His face was sweated and looking quite strained. Eyes half open and mouth wide, gasping for needed air. A clear need to cool himself and regain some form of energy was obvious to his face, but the moment to attack was now. His prowess as a fighter would not relent such an opportune moment to be missed. Uncertainty in the back of his mind told him that such a chance may not have happened again if he were to allow something as simple as fatigue to dull his warrior senses. And even with the two combatants above him, both far and shown capable in their unique choice of weapons, Kiba felt something similar to obligation to see his opponent done in with his own sword. Neither parties seemed interested in fighting the other. Their goals were the same. Saji watched it all with a silent appreciation. From Kiba's staunch keeping to combat without need of rest to the unspoken truce still in play between peerages, there was a pleasing sight to the madness unfolding. And now, with his opponent thoroughly had by his own move, this day was starting to turn in quite a wonderful manner. Naruto's hands still writhed around the strain of the line, hoping to rip the hold through means of brute force and only to discover he could not. Whatever sort of odd material made up absorption line's tongue, it didn't give way easily. It was sticky and hardened at the same moment, with the human finding it odd how his fingers felt as if they were grazing over sandpaper while also being stuck to it like some sort of adhesive. Blue eyes moved from the tightly wrapped whatever and towards the three devils now little more than a foot from his side. Their weapons swung out to meet him. Devils were, by their very physiology, extraordinarily durable creatures. Truly, their endurance and ability to keep fighting was unquestionably above the common creature, as the centuries past of constant warfare and conflict have undoubtedly shown. Even with their bodies being less heavy or large as to that of trolls, ogres or giants, all walks of existence knew to never doubt a devil's prowess. Like any beast of land or air or sea, when cornered or confronted with a great challenge, the inhabitants of the underworld oft found strength they themselves were unaware of and managed to fight off superior numbers throughout their combative history. However, a fact remained the same, nonetheless. Be they of the underworld, the human world, the heavens above or some faraway world of unknown creation, sharpened pieces of metal being pushed deep into the thigh, shoulder and bicep hurt like hell. Humans, such as Naruto, were no exception to this rule. Rias did manage to hold some form of composure as the three weapons pushed into her nephew, feeling only the need to take in a long breath as she heard the tearing of cloth and bones from her place. Her eyes widened, her fingers wrapped themselves tightly into fists and glowed a violent red, while her expression read as if seeing something unexpected. The boy still breathed. The wounds were not fatal. But Rias felt unexpected discomfort watching his blood begin to pour forth from his wounds. Her mouth was held shut and tight, maybe to hold back the need to shout or whimper. It felt dry, too, and she was certain it wasn't due to heat or thirst. She tried swallowing, but it did little to help or alleviate the weight in her throat. Even thinking about avoiding the sight of Naruto was not as easily done as she might have wished. Of course, this was not the first time Rias experienced violence. Blood and the suffering of others did not faze her as it once had in her younger years. Her training in the underworld and practice with strays prepared her for such views. But seeing Naruto twitch in pain as he looked over his wounded person made her feel uncomfortable. She was not the only one to react. Oh Naruto-kun, Asia's whisper was unnerving on the Grimoire side of the area. She might have been crying, Rias could not say. Her focus did not waver from her nephew. But she thought she could make out the former nun's form nervously shifting and shaking as she looked over the clearing. Please be all right, please, she was hopeful, at least. Akeno appeared more stable than the others. She simply watched without expression, neither appearing uncomfortable with the sight nor exceptionally enthused. She simply watched the boy from behind the trees. He'll be fine, Rias stated loudly, her voice still held strength to it, but also an obvious uncertainty to the moment's happenings. It wasn't particularly loud, not enough to be heard by the boys she stared towards, but enough to garner some attention and curiosity from the women around her. Naruto-kun, he's dealt with worse. This was true. Just give him a minute and he'll. Poof. Sona was closer to Naruto when the attack happened. She could hear the metal as it pushed past the human's clothes. She could see how the metal tore so easily through his skin and bone. She felt his pain by his stricken breath alone, as glints of steel made their way out of his back. By comparison to her two bishops, whom seemed to be holding back their own vocal concerns and worries from escaping their lips, the Cetri king looked positively peaceful. Outwardly, of course, her plan went without a hitch. Better, even, than she suspected it would. A plan she did not wholly expect to end in such a result. She planned for his escape, she would admit. She planned for her elusive friend to have avoided or even worked through Saji's attack and already had spells ready for his next move. And if that did not occur and, by chance, her pawn's sacred gear did manage to prevent his movements, then she expected some minor to severe damage by the weapons. He would guard against them, taking some form of injuries by his shielding, but would be open for one of her two attacking servants to take hold of the bells. Tsubaki, undoubtedly, would have seized the opportunity in a normal circumstance. Of course, this last possibility was more of a hypothetical incidence or silent hope than anything else. Naruto was crafty. Getting his bells would probably take more time and effort. Those were her thoughts. The three devils handled themselves well, all things considered, for piercing their colleague so viciously. Kiba held his sword tightly, its metal pressed deeply into Naruto's leg, rendering any additional movement impossible even with absorption line's power. He did not look so bad for someone stabbing his weapon into another person, especially his longtime friend. But she was aware of the young man's temperament since their first meeting, so perhaps fighting friends came with a certain ease she was not aware of. Tsubaki and Toma were different, if only a little. They kept their weapons pointed, holding the boy back, but with minor bouts of hesitation and uncertainty in their eyes. Stabbing someone who wasn't a stuffed dummy was probably new for them. Their experience with conflict in life was limited. Controlled training environments and practice bouts were one thing, but actual combat. Their pasts kept their minds active and comparable to her own so that they might have worked easily out in the clearing. They might have imagined this just like any of her exercises, hard, heart-pumping, but ultimately safe for everyone. No death, no serious injuries, just a challenge which, in the end, everyone would find themselves laughing about. After all, Naruto was only a single human against over a dozen devils. What challenge would that be? They would best him then move on from the moment. Simple, easy, even, no worries or concerns. Their thoughts changed, obviously, with Naruto's little showing of himself, a showing which made obvious that this challenge was heralded by someone of capability and strength. Which, thankfully, was the reason why they now handled their peer with an appropriate resolve and manner. They were not hesitant in their taking him, and Sona would acknowledge their ability to press forward with their attack, telling them they did adequately later. But the outcome of her human friend's actual taking of damage was unexpected. The king opened her mouth to say something, maybe to convey her uncertainty on this unexpected turn or to offer words to her servants in preparation to move against the Grimoire peerage. Maybe she only wished to speak or make something of a sound to break the chill and stillness around them from the successive attack. But her mouth barely opened to halfway to where she would have liked before a rather evident sound rang out into the clearing. Poof! A cloud of smoke blew out from Naruto's body. It burst from every inch of his person, covering him in its whitish shade. It wasn't a screening for escape. The amount of smog was too little for that, barely carrying out from his figure. And the queen and two knights still recognized their weapons were engaged in something thick and rough, even as their worry turned to surprise by the appearance of this colorless haze. It was another bout of smoke similar to with the conjuring of Naruto's double. It came and left as quickly as it came. But where before, a perfect copy of the boy flew ready and waiting to help its twin, now a stranger thing took the place of where the blonde once was. In the place of the pained youth now stood a tightly strung together scarecrow. 4 limbs, hay-made, a perfect semblance of man. Simple, but this mannequin of feed and fiber was not simply that, no. From its tightly threaded arms and legs, this replacement to the human teen's position wore a matching colored set of shorts and hoodie, complete with a rather pointed top of its head to as if match the Uzumaki's hair. Even where its face would be, a coy smile could be found. Threaded together between the stalks of hay, the smirk of the scarecrow had a light making of a tongue sticking out in an attempted, blowing a raspberry, in addition to the curve of its eyes to make it seem as if it were delighted by the present happenings. Instead of being irked at again being duped, it seemed the queen and knights decided to take a moment's breath. They had been tricked, sure, but it seemed the revelation that they didn't just acupuncture their colleague left them a bit light-headed but happy. That thought alone, at least somewhat, relieved a stress which lingered in the air. But now, where was the blonde? The Sea-Tree King already began her search. Her cool gaze went over the grass, the trees close and far, and moved with a certain tenacity most commonly seen by predators looking for their next meal. She did not appear to be panicked yet but felt as if she were the only one to significantly care for the threat still wandering around. Her bishops let out some tired and relieved breaths from their lungs at the thought that maybe their friends did not ruthlessly stab the boy in the clearing. Her knight and queen were still ripping their tools out from their hay-made opponent, while her rook and pawns seemed only too confused by. Sona found him. Behind her newest pawn. A small movement behind his shadow caught her eye. Naruto hands were coming together, making something of a gesture between them. A few fingers pointed upwards, a few curved as if making a fist. She'd seen this sort of thing with him before. And she was only all too aware when he made such a signal that he was then able to produce results profound and almost magical in nature. Dangerous and destructive, even, if he so desired. Saji and his guards were completely unaware as he crouched behind. And that is when Sona screamed, "Saji, get out of there. Well, they certainly have a handle on the whole kill me thing." Naruto thought to himself, his expression mirthful and amused as he watched his little placeholder spew pieces of cut hay from its back and front. He laid crouched into the shadow of Saji's person, unnoticed by the youth or his guards, and quietly looked over the surrounding area. His dummy seemed none too dismayed as it undoubtedly still had the sewn smile on its face, even as sharpened steel was ripped from its posture. The trio of weapon wielders looked put off by this disturbance and replacement of character struck. Tomo and Tsubaki were bewildered, eyes widened and blinking as if caught in some illusion. While Kiba, though winded, fixed his appearance to seem calmer and more controlled than the situation was allowing him. The Sea-Tree servants could not be blamed for their lack of awareness to the humans' abilities or their stunned outlook on them. Sona only held a small understanding of his full capabilities, barely enough to convey her true fears towards the son of Lucifer. But the Grimoire Knight was different. Having grown up alongside his friend and seen this tactic done several times, he was more familiar with this sort of happening than he cared to admit. Maybe he was even quietly cursing himself for falling for such a simple ploy again and at such a crucial moment. It was difficult to say. But to be fair, how many in creation would actively suspect someone to burst into smoke and be replaced by, say, a log or scarecrow from seemingly nowhere? Answer: very few. Whatever surprise or worry there might have been on the human's distinctive features, with Naruto's body run through thrice without issue, was now replaced with quiet amusement. A look which would leave anyone to wonder if there ever was true worry to his features the moment prior. Secondly, he did take notice of a flash of light coming from further down the wooded area. He could make out Sona's expression from there, along with her remaining servants alongside her, as she already began her search for him. She was tenacious, he'd give her that. He wondered if Rias was of a similar mind to search for him. He had yet to see her crimson hair since the match began, though he once or twice thought he heard Asia from the bushes, whimpering for a reason or another. He'd have to draw them out sooner or later. But now was not the time. Now, instead, he was offered a rather unique moment as he stood in the shadow of the recently turned pawn of Sea-Tree. The youth was unguarded and unprotected from his back, leaving himself hopelessly open. In fact, Naruto had a particular manner by which he could cause a situation to occur with only minor injury, if he so desired. It would certainly be a way of garnering everyone's attention back to him. But should I, or should I not? It was, as he reflected from personal experience, a move of immense brutality and unconventional occurrence that he questioned whether Saji deserved to have such a punishment dealt onto him. In his mind, he was a dumb little shit when his sensei brought his own technique down, or rather, up, on him, with little mercy or care to be found. Could he really be so devious? So twisted? To one so green and unprepared for what would come next? He wondered that for only a moment, looking pensive as he still kept out of sight from the devil teens, then shrugged. Yeah, I probably could. He brought his hands together, twisting fingers into their needed positions, and began to aim himself towards the backside of his peer. His eyes glistened in a harsh, distinctively twisted manner. That's when he heard the yell. Saji! Sona's voice cried out, startling everyone enough for eyes to turn towards the forest's edge. This was perhaps the first most had ever heard her voice spoken at such volumes. Get out of there. The pawn only had time to look confused even as the eyes of several devils quickly fell towards him. The looks he received were both stunned and frightful, with many looking mildly worried as if wanting to scream out further warnings to the unsuspecting youth. It was, however, too late. Naruto offered as many words to the youth, watching as Saji perked his head around and only just noticed the boy in his shadow. In response to this movement, the ninja's fingers rose. And what happened next would be engraved into the minds of the devils for decades to come. But for Saji, it would be an experience he would never forget. Secret Taijutsu. Poke. 1000 Years of Death. DERRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRRrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrr those watching. Rias felt her face contort with pained horror, mouth opened and eyes disbelieving of what they just witnesses. Oh, geez, Naruto. Asia moved her hands over her lips and held a prevalent red to her cheeks. My goodness, what she viewed would, unquestionably, leave a mark on the poor second-year boy. Akano, meanwhile, gave up her attempt at stealth as she began to laugh rather recklessly from behind the bark and leaves. Oh my, Naruto-kun. Why you? She laughed a little harder, finding it difficult to form sentences or words in that moment. From the other side of the woods, the two Cetri bishops watched their friend's punishment without amusement. He is trash, Momo repeated her declaration of the boy once more, looking harder and fiercer than before. Absolute, without question, garbage. Rhea looked aghast but could not offer any words to argue against such a crude observation. Perhaps she even agreed, for who could ever be so uncouth as to use such an attack? But Sona's expression was unquestionably the most taken by what she'd seen. Her glasses were tilted from their position on the bridge of her nose, eyes wide and holding an evident perplexity to them, while her mouth wide open with a practical gape. Her entire visage indicated an absolute incomprehension to what she'd just viewed. Although, whether it was due to the damage dealt onto her pawn or the fact it was her longtime friend to deal such an absurd and harsh attack, it was difficult to say. She did not recover from her stupor as quickly as she usually would from such an unexpected sight. And then that left only those still in the clearing. Of course, those nearest to the Saji, Ruruko and Subara, for example, were visibly disturbed by the happenings, as the pawn's scream resounded through them with a chilling effect. Its sheer volume alone echoed for some distance past the clearing, as if it were the cry of some great animal. It was almost terrifying. The visual alone of what occurred was horrific enough, but with the ear-splitting cry, peerage morale seemed to weaken and fail briefly. Tsubaki and Tomo were no different from their fellow servants. Undeniably, being familiar with the pawn, both held a level of worry and concern for his well-being. Tomo herself appeared the worse of the pair, visibly holding back tears and flustered expression after watching her younger pawn be sent skyward from their human opponent. While Tsubaki appeared actually quite similar to her king, dazed, confused, and with a look which spoke volumes of her disbelief at what just occurred. Kiba found the whole visual to be an uncomfortable experience to watch, wondering if he would be dealt a similar blow. His body curled itself tightly at the thought, only wondering how he would deal with such a blow himself should Naruto feel particularly ruthless that morning. He decided, amidst a wave of self-preservation, to keep his guard ready. And then there was Kaneko. Out of everyone, she unanimously looked the least fazed by whatever caught everyone's distraught. She neither looked bothered or caught off guard by whatever had just occurred to her eyes. However, the young ashen-haired rook could not resist putting in her 2 cents over Saji's dilemma. Savage. And then that left only the last of the devils, Saji. Saji laid some 50+ feet away from his original position. Stunned, pained expression for all to see, his posture was slouched over the grass. The tiniest of whimpers and cries could be heard from his lips, the only clue he was still conscious or breathing. And now, while the look and sounds were nothing at all exceptional to the parties watching, it was rather how he was, for lack of better word, prostrated on the earth which made the moment all the more harsh and unforgiving. The devil teen held his rear to the sky. His hands went around to his backside and attempted to soothe whatever ache was prominent. And by his earnestness for which he swept his fingers over his behind, uncaring of those whom might judge him or perhaps not even noticing through the pain he felt, the idea that whatever discomfort he felt must have been considerable was made all the clearer. TSSSK, Aya. As his cries continued, Naruto watched from his original spot, doing little in the way of movement besides returning to his full height. His hands disconnected and lost whatever gesture they'd created, now comfortably resting inside his pockets while his eyes entertained the going-ons around him. He was not surprised by the reactions he could see. Secret taijutsu. 1,000 years of death was, arguably, the most unorthodox of Naruto's destructive arsenal of capabilities. It's not particularly flashy, though it most certainly grabs the attention of those around. It's not particularly a difficult move, requiring no actual energy or chakra in its use, though perhaps at least some focus and precision in its completion. And despite its rather exaggerative and impressively sounding name, it really only had the preparatory requirement of needing to be behind one's adversary. The basis for how to set up the technique was a simple one. First, make sure your hands are tightly pressed together, as if making a rock out of your fist. Then, have a few fingers pointing straight, preferably 4. Second, have a clear opening towards an opponent's lower back side. Third, position oneself low and aim towards the center of the opposition's lower back. The crack of the posterior, specifically. And finally, drive fingers forward towards targeted area. For a lack of subtlety or sophistication, 1,000 Years of Death was, by its very design, an exaggeratedly named almighty finger poke up the ass. Its effects were devastating, nonetheless. In fact, Naruto could recall the first use of the technique on his person and its rather extreme reaction towards his own team. The reactions and viewings were amusing, he supposed, at least for his sensei. And as it so happened, his first venture with the mighty finger thrust happened in an almost exactly similar situation as today. With a test, involving bells, and a requirement to come at a man with the intent to kill. It definitely made the top 10 most embarrassing moments of his previous life. Now, of course, maybe Naruto had tried a little too hard to perform such a wicked technique in such a similar setting. He really had no need to use it, he could have done just as easily without. But then, he was trying to return to something which egged at the back of his mind. Perhaps he sought a form of nostalgia alongside his little game. Well, be that as it may, it would seem Saji was more reactive towards 1,000 years than he was. The boy had yet to stand upright, deciding the present was a more readily available time to nurse his pierced bottom, while his compatriots looked none too ready in wanting to jump into the fray. But in truth, how many would like to pick a fight with a guy who sends devils flying via ass poke? Sorry, Saji, Naruto quietly apologized, bringing his hands together in a silent prayer. I can only hope you'll forgive me in the next life. He meant it in jest, and knew those around him would see it as a mocking. A silly one, at that. But prayers and devils don't mix. Saji shook on the floor of the clearing, his face twisting even further into agony. As if something sharp had ripped through him. His hands twitched from their positions at his rear and quickly went to his head, for only a quick moment, before finding themselves returned back to their lower caressing positions. Naruto was momentarily curious by such a scream, before looking down to his hands. Even while outnumbered by devils of significant ability and strength, the human at least had the decency to look sheepish by his fallacy. I may need to repay Saji for that. Afterwards, of course. He took a step forward, the small movement intentional. He gauged the reactions from his single pace. Maybe he expected Subara to attack in retaliation. She was the type. Ruruko, on the other hand, was more than just a little cautious, partly due to her age and inexperience. Understandable for the young girl. But instead, the rook and her fellow pawn fell a step away from him, tense and wary, as they quickly positioned themselves defensively further away some few meters. They were scared, or, at least, cautious. But this was fine. No one could blame them. Tired, hungry, and going up against an opponent who's all but willing to make each and every devil around look like children. It would be folly to think so lightly of such a foe, in circumstances inappropriate for their teams. Before the fight even began, Naruto had effectively taken the field's advantage before even stepping onto it. Hey, Kakashi-sensei must have had a field day with us, Naruto mused, curling his eyes away from the stiffness of the two servants and back towards the sakura tree. His eyes narrowed only a little, lingering over the electronic still perched by the wood's side. 2.5 hours left, he shouted, turning his attention back to the devils. Some still seemed in a stupor, while others turned to the clock themselves to check what time remained. He was right. Who wants to go next? Any volunteers? He was taunting them into action, which no one in the clearing seemed ready to put a stop towards. His smile, bright and cheerful and without worry, was the worst thing of all. It was little more than a smirk, coupled with a calm which only someone who felt completely in control of the situation they were in could do. But to answer his beckoning for willing participants, it would seem someone was more than willing to respond to his calling. "All volunteer," a smooth, controlled voice called overhead. Naruto lifted his head, turning it skyward and krrr crack. From the heavens, a stream of light and power fell to the earth. It hit the soil with a burst and shudder, shaking its surroundings with its sheer force and destructive flow. And worst yet, it seemed to have taken hold of the human in its wide berth, as the energy, a bolt of lightning, pure and blinding, bombarded the terrain without mercy. How strange, it must have seemed, to see such a sight on such a clear blue day. To anyone unused to such extremities being a norm amongst Devilkin, this might have seemed as if a miracle in itself. "But I must warn you, Naruto-kun." The voice spoke again, grabbing the attention of many devils as they turned their eyes away from the human and upwards to a long, dark-haired beauty of a young woman hovering above. She was quite the sight. Her hands coated themselves in torrents of chaotic bolts of white, bouncing and twisting through her fingers and wrists in an almost lively manner, while a pair of leathery wings stretched outward from her lower back. Akeno Himehime could only smile down to her audience, even as the focused bit of lightning ceased its destructive display. Her cheeks turned red, as Naruto still stood under the point of her assault, but seemed riveted by his endurance. The ground laid bare and dead, with naught but the dirt to remain where grass once rested, but the blonde still stood with his head turned high. His clothes seemed to have taken a hitting. His hoodie was singed and torn from place to place, his shorts seemed to have a few places burnt as if lit one moment before, and even his sandals seemed to have had their straps wearied out to the point where they seemed only to be held by a few strings. But his appearance was still the same. He smiled up to her, now noticing her presence, and had his hands still tucked away in his pockets. His face seemed largely the same, with maybe a seeming patch of dirt or some sort of dust splashed over his cheeks, the only proof his person was even hit by the assault of energy, but otherwise he did not appear staggered by the Devil Queen aerial offensive. But if Akeno was displeased by this lack of damage dealt, it did not show. She smiled, in fact, for those who could see, a little more fondly, her cheeks crimsoning an aroused red. "I can be a real pain in the ass to deal with." The smirk grazing Naruto's lips allowed for a small laugh to escape as his friend talked the talk down to him. He would admit, Akeno caught him by surprise. He neither sensed her presence nor expected her attack. Not so soon, at least. Naruto actually found himself proud of her. The old leader saw her improvement as a progress which needed to be encouraged, even if such a skill could and probably would be used against him. Not even his successor showed such aptitude in her younger years, and she was a brilliant ninja in every stretch of the word. And while the end result of her magically generated lightning was not particularly devastating or harmful, at least in the way to himself, it was still a wonder that her ability to sneak by his awareness was as effective as it was. He, the former Hokage, did not feel her attack come until the very last moment. "Way to go, Akeno," he mentally praised, moving a hand to his shoulder to pat out the remains of burnt cloth which threatened to alight his hoodie. But this was the worst of the damage dealt to his person, as this occurrence was hardly the first time he had need to deal with a lightning user. Or, on a more specific example, the first time he dealt with Akeno's basis of magically generated elemental practice. Which, while still potent and borderline deadly in its own rights, was scarcely what Naruto could recall the true power of nature's storm was capable of. And he knew, by intense memory, what it was to feel the full force of a bolt of lightning. Thousands, even, directed to himself, specifically. It hurt, a lot, but now was not the time to wonder on the differences and potencies between nature and magic. Instead, the focus needed to return to the present concern. Time was still running, and Naruto barely felt the enjoyment he so sought. Nor did his challenge come close to completion. Not by a long shot. And so, as the saying goes, the show must go on. "Funny," he shouted to his friend, his features lowering into a stance. The first time, in fact, since arriving in the clearing. He now looked ready to fight. "People say the same thing about me." Time remaining. 2 hours, 28 minutes, 32 seconds. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like, comment and subscribe, as well as checking out the author on fanfiction.net.